Thank you very much, Brother Alex. Is it good to be in the house of the Lord today? I feel like today, feels like the first day of spring to me. I just feel in a spring-like mood. I think just because of the rain and it's beautiful weather outside, it feels like winter is slowly trickling off. But as you know, the spring storms can still be pretty heavy and we can still get a lot of snow. Today, I would like to talk about the tragedy of Jephthah. And this has been a story in the Bible that's always bothered me. Has it bothered any of you? Well, you wouldn't be alone. You would not be alone in being uncomfortable from this story. Now, I remember when I was in undergraduate school at University of Colorado Springs, I took a literature class, and I was never much of a literature person, not very good at English and literary talents. But this class, I forget what it was called. It was not just your any old literature class. They really went in depth. And we would read short stories like, I heard a fly buzz when I died. Interesting story. Or we would look at a poem like Two Roads Diverged in a Yellow Wood, and we would analyze the poem. What was the author thinking? What do we think? And the way we analyze this poem, is it the same point that the author tried to get across? So one particular day, the professor started talking about some of the stories in the Bible. And he said he had read the Bible all the way through, but there were two stories that bothered him more than anything else. One was Abraham and Isaac being offered up as a sacrifice to the Lord. And then the worst was Judges 11, where Jephthah sacrifices his daughter. And he said that he does not understand why Christians can worship a God like this. He had read the Bible the whole way through. He felt that he understood it. And he said, quote unquote, I have no interest in worshiping a God that would ask someone to offer up their child as a sacrifice to him. So given that, he made me think. I thought about it a while. And it's always been something that's been an uncomfortable story for me, and I'm sure it's been for you as well. My question for the congregation today is Jephthah a good man? Is he a man of faith? Just real quick, raise the hands. Is this a good man of faith? Is this somebody that belongs in the Bible because he's a good man? He did great things. He's right up there with Moses and Elijah and all these things. Well, we'll look at it. I think to all of us, there's good sides and there's bad sides. And when we look in the Bible, we see both the good and the bad of people who have come before us. So I'd like us to open up to Judges 10, 9 through 16. And the story of Jephthah kind of has a different twist since I brought up literature, in its literary analysis of the story. It's got a different twist. And if we start reading in Judges 10, verses 9 through 16. Actually, I think I wrote that down incorrectly. Let's go to 6. Let's go to start at Judges 10, verse 6. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth and the gods of Syria and the gods of Sidon and the gods of Moab and the gods of the Ammonites and the gods of the Philistines. And they forsook the Lord and did not serve him. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of the Philistines and into the hand of the Amorites. And they crushed and oppressed the people of Israel that year. For 18 years they oppressed the people of Israel. And they were beyond the Jordan, and who were beyond the Jordan, and the land of the Amorites, which is in Gilead. And the Amorites crossed the Jordan to fight against Judah, and against Benjamin, and against the house of Ephraim, so that Israel was severely distressed. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, saying, We have sinned against you, because we have forsaken our God and served the Baals. And the Lord said unto the people of Israel, Did I not save you from the Egyptians and the Amorites and the Ammonites and from the Philistines? The Sidonians and the Amalekites and the Manoahites oppressed you, and you cried to me, and I saved you out of their hand. Yet you have forsaken me and served other gods. Therefore, I will save you no more. Go and cry to the gods whom you have chosen. Let them save you in your time of distress." And the people of Israel said to the Lord, "We have sinned. Do to us whatever seems good to you. Only, please, deliver us this day." So they put away the foreign gods among them and served the Lord, and he became impatient over the misery of Israel. Why is this unique? In many other stories about the Israelites forsaking the Lord and serving other gods, the Lord allows people to come in and invade and attack them, and the story goes on. But here there's actually a dialogue. You're going to see that the story of Jephthah, there's always a dialogue. There's wheeling, there's dealing between God and Israel, between Jephthah and Israel, Jephthah and God, Jephthah and the Amorites. Everyone's trying to make a deal. Everyone's trying to figure something out. Here Israel is telling God, "Deliver us." He says, "No." And they say, "Well, we'll still make a deal with you. Deliver us." So they're actually dealing with God. And in the midst of all of this, we have Jephthah that enters. Jephthah, you'll find him primarily in Judges 11 and a little bit of Judges 12. The name Jephthah is unique because in Hebrew it means he that opens, meaning he that opens his mouth. It implies a man that opens his mouth and speaks a lot, kind of going along with the theme of dialogue, verbal dialogue between different people. Now, Judges 11, 1 through 6 describes Jephthah. He is a Gileadite. His father was Gilead. His father had multiple sons from one woman, but then Jephthah became the unfortunate side effect of a prostitute, and he was the son of a prostitute and his father Gilead. So when the boys, all the kids grow up, and maybe the father dies, the other brothers say to Jephthah, "You have no part in our inheritance," and they kick him out of the family. And Jephthah moves out and he becomes the leader of a band of outlaws in the area of Syria. And he flees away from his people and from his inheritance. He lives in the land of Tob. What happens next is the Ammonites attack Israel. So let's go to Judges 11, 6 through 11. After the Ammonites attack Israel, the leaders in the tribe of Gilead, the people of Gilead, come and they decide to have some dialogue with Jephthah. Hence the art of the deal here, part 1. And they say to Jephthah, "Come and be our leader, that we may fight against the Ammonites." But Jephthah said to the leaders or the elders of Gilead, "Did not you hate me and drive me out of my father's house? Why have you come to me now, when you are in distress?" And the elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, "That is why we have turned to you now, that you may go out with us and fight against the Ammonites, and be our head over all the inhabitants of Gilead." Jephthah then said to the elders of Gilead, "If you bring me home again to fight against the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them over to me, I will be your head." And then the elders of Gilead say to Jephthah, "The Lord will be a witness between us if we do not say to you, if we do not do as you say." So Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and leader over them. And Jephthah spoke all of these words before the Lord at Mizpah. So suddenly, where does Jephthah go? He goes from a man who's been kicked out, who's lived with a bunch of rebels, going, pillaging, stealing, and suddenly he has the chance to be a ruler. Now, just in Judges 9 and 10, there is another man called Abimelech, very similar. He wants to make himself king over all Israel. I always thought of Saul being the first king, but Abimelech, similar to Jephthah, has plans in his mind to become a ruler over all Israel. Jephthah here decides in his part 1 of his deal that he's going to make a plan with Israel. I fight the Ammonites for you, you make me your ruler. Notice in here, nowhere did God raise up Jephthah. Israel raised up Jephthah. And the Gileadites actually raised up Jephthah, and they said, you become our ruler. So Israel deals with God, Israel deals with Jephthah. They're taking matters into their own hands. So Jephthah's an opportunist. He's become a leader of a band of men. He's quite powerful. And suddenly he thinks he can be ruler over Israel. If I fight and Yahweh blesses, then I will rule. We have a deal. So, as I've brought up previously, God never came to the people of Israel and said, I will raise up Jephthah. If you compare this to Gideon, if you compare this to Samson, these are all supernatural things where an angel comes down and speaks with Gideon or the mother and father of Samson and raises up a prophet. Or a prophetess like Deborah comes and brings forward the word of the Lord. But in this case, this is Israel taking matters into their own hands. But, however, what does the Lord do? It says just a few verses down that the Spirit of the Lord is with Jephthah. So even though mankind makes up their own decisions, the Lord decides to bless it. Next part is the art of the deal, part 2 by Jephthah. And we'll go to Judges 11, 12 through 28. And I find this very interesting, and we'll talk a little bit about Jephthah's communication with the Ammonites. Starting in 12. Then Jephthah said to the messengers, sent messengers to the king of the Ammonites and said, What have you against me, that you have come to fight against me and against my land? And the king of the Ammonites answered the messengers of Jephthah, Because Israel, on coming up from Egypt, took away the land from Arnon to Jabbok and to the Jordan, now therefore restore it peaceably. Jephthah again sent messengers to the king of the Ammonites and said, Thus says Jephthah, Israel did not take away the land of Moab or the land of the Ammonites. And this goes into a long, drawn-out conversation where Jephthah pretty much describes Israel coming out of the land. They have a war with the Moabites and conquer the Moabites' land. And Jephthah's whole premise is that this land that Ammon wants is really formerly Moabite land. And it's very interesting, as I've gone over some of the commentary here, there have been two views. One is that Jephthah is an amazing negotiator. He comes and he goes through a deep, laid-out plan with the king of Ammon and presents the rights of Israel. But then the other view, which I think is more realistic, is that Jephthah is a big failure. He that opens his mouth, as is his very name, is kind of a laughingstock. And here's why. If you read in there, Jephthah talks about Chemosh, the god of the Ammonites. And Chemosh really wasn't the god of the Ammonites. He was the god of the Moabites. So Jephthah mixes up his gods. He's confused. He mixes up his gods. And some think that he, in this long thing, was trying to insult the Ammonites by claiming the wrong god. Secondly, how is Jephthah a failure? If you look towards the end of his communication in verse 24, it says, Will you not possess what Chemosh your God gives you to possess? And all the Lord our God has dispossessed, therefore before us we will possess. So in the way he states that, he makes the Israelite God equal with the pagan god Chemosh, saying, Your God gave you your land, our God gave you our land, we should be happy. He does not treat the God of Israel as the God of all gods. And many scholars have looked at that and thought that that is very strange. So they feel that Jephthah's deal here that he was trying to make with Ammon was false, it was foolish, And the reason why the king of Ammonite responded to him with soldiers and not listening to him is because Jephthah was very ineffective in the way he spoke with the king of Ammon. Art of the Deal, Part 3. So Part 1, with Israel. Part 2, Jephthah deals with Ammon, fails at that. Part 3, Jephthah comes and deals with God. Judges 11:29, like I spoke before, says the Spirit of Yahweh is upon Jephthah, and he gathers his men for war. In Judges 11:30, I'd like us to read that real quick. It says, "And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, and he said, 'If you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then,'" and we'll finish the rest later. How does Jephthah treat God? And how should we treat God? He's making a contingency plan. He's feeling that God can be manipulated. He's tried to manipulate Ammon. He's manipulated Israel to his own gain. He's trying to manipulate God to his own gain. Verse 31, "Then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the Ammonites, shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it for a burnt offering." Ellen White does not say very much about Jephthah, which I was surprised. I tried to find a lot of comments, very brief mention, and not much positive. So I've looked into other commentaries as well. And it's interesting because many commentaries and many original ways that people looked at this, they've made attempts to show that Jephthah only contemplated offering, let's say, the family dog or the goat that lived in the house with the family. And I've heard that excuse myself. Oh, he didn't know a human being would come out. But when you look at the original Hebrew, when they say, "cometh forth to meet me," that is always in the Bible used of a person. So the argument is, it doesn't matter how it looks in our eyes, but when he said these statements, only a human could have been something or somebody who would have come out to meet him. That suggests that Jephthah was expecting a human sacrifice from the very beginning, from him saying this statement. This, in pulpit commentary on Judges, it says that only a human being could have come forth to meet him, and it was a common phrase always spoken. And you'll see it in Genesis 14:17, in Exodus, in Numbers, and 1 Samuel. It's all through the Old Testament. Judges 11:32 through 33 talks about the war. So Jephthah has made this deal with God. He has manipulated God. He's made a pact with God. Now he goes to war against Ammon. And since we've all been reading and looking and learning so much about how things were at this time, it doesn't look like the pointer works that well, but you can see all that red, all those red lines, that is where Jephthah attacked the Ammonites. So remember, we were talking last Sabbath, you have the Jordan River, which is here on the far side. And we were talking about the half-tribe of Manasseh and the other tribes that were on the east side of the river, how they were closer to idolatry. That was the case because there you have Gilead, Gad. Above you have Ephraim, or the half-tribe of Manasseh. Ephraim's on the west side of the river, and then you have Ammon right next to Gad in Gilead. And Jephthah's mother was a Syrian, just a little bit to the north and the east. So these people, like we had talked about previously, grew up in close proximity to paganism. Jephthah wins. He wins the day, he wins the battle, and then he comes home to his family. So open your Bibles to Judges 11:34 through 39. Then Jephthah came to his home at Mizpah. Mizpah's right up there to the northwest of Ammon. And behold, his daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and dances. She was his only child. Beside her he had neither son nor daughter. And as soon as he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low, and you have become the cause of great trouble for me. For I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow. And she said to him, My father, you have opened your mouth to the Lord. Do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, now that the Lord has avenged you and your enemies, on your enemies, and on the Ammonites. So she said to her father, Let this thing be done for me. Leave me alone 2 months, that I may go down on the mountains and weep for my virginity, and I and my companions. So he said, Go. And then he sent her away for 2 months, and she departed, and she and her companions wept for her virginity on the mountains. And when the end of the 2 months had come, she returned to her father, who did to her according to his vow that he had made. She had never known a man, and it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went year by year to lament the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite, 4 days in that year. Interesting. Jephthah means one who opens his mouth. In Judges 11:35, I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take it back. Notice, this guy is a big wheeler and dealer. He's making plans, but you know what? He cannot take back what his mouth has said. My question for the church is, could he have taken it back? Is it okay to take it back? He's vowed to the Lord. Anytime you make a promise to the Lord, don't you have to obey it? Well, looking back at evaluation at what vow means there, the word in Hebrew is neder, which is one type of vow. And then there's another type of vow called cherem. It's very funny, and it means devoted to destruction. And that is what you hear about with Achan. The devoted things, that's the word. Cherem. Anything that's devoted to destruction, that is another vow that is the Lord's only. That vow cannot be taken back. But Jephthah's vow of neder could have been taken back. Very interesting in some of the Jewish midrashes, they say that Jephthah, since he was raised semi-pagan, was ignorant of some of the substitution allowments that the Lord had allowed. For example, if you vow something to the Lord, you can substitute it. For example, the firstborn was always vowed to the Lord, but that was substituted with an ox or a lamb or a sacrifice. And that was in Leviticus 27, 1 through 8. Also very interesting is other historians like Josephus, they blame the daughter. And they say that she was selfish for running out to Jephthah and causing her father distress. So there's all kinds of confusion when people looked at this, especially early on in the church history. But as people look at the way Jephthah was raised, where he was raised, and where his daughter was raised, one more recent scholar says that about Jephthah's daughter, he considers her embracing of the sacrificial death, actually no, this is an older one. Older people felt that her embracing of the sacrificial death was something to be looked up to, that it was something that was great, that she was a cheerful martyr for her father and for the Lord. But more recently, looking at this, it is felt that because Jephthah's daughter was raised in a pagan land, she thought that this was acceptable, and she thought that it was the right thing to do. And he thought that this was the right thing to do. That's why she was open to it. Was it because she was such a submissive, wonderful daughter, or was it she was raised in a pagan place where they did this act all the time? And that's the way they feel about it. They say here, the idea of human sacrifice was not so strange to her mind as it is to ours. The sacrifice of his eldest son as a burnt offering by the king of Moab some 300 years later in 2 Kings 37 showed that it was common. Also, sacrifices of the children to Molech is often spoken of in Scripture. You see that in Micah 6:7, and we'll go over that in just a moment. Additionally, sacrifices in Carthage, which was just a little bit west of Egypt, was very common, where every time something bad happened, they would take a young child and sacrifice him so they could appease the gods. So, many commentators feel that we must take this in mind when we think of the story of Jephthah. Leviticus 18:21. You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Leviticus 22. Say to the people of Israel, anyone in the house of the people of Israel or of the strangers who sojourn in Israel who gives any of his children to Molech shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. Micah 6 verse 8 says, shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body, for the sin of my soul? Verse 8, he has told you, O man, what is right and good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly before your God. So my question for us is, what went wrong? Was this God's fault? Was this something that Jephthah should have followed through with? Ellen White in Patriarchs of Prophets says that no vow should be kept to the Lord if it includes breaking of his law. I think the story of Jephthah can give us a couple things that we can think about ourselves. Because I know we brought it up last Sabbath about the tribes on the east side of the Jordan. And we also have talked about how the tribes failed to extinguish all the heathens among them. The way he raised his daughter allowed him to be confused. His theology, his understanding of God was totally twisted. Pulpit Bible Commentary says, the son of a strange woman, probably as we have seen, she was Assyrian and had passed many years in exile in Syria. Now it is well known that human sacrifices were frequently practiced in Syria, as they were made also by the Ammonites, who made their children to pass through the fires of Moloch. And it cannot surprise us that a man who was brought up as Jephthah was leading the life of a freebooter at the head of a band of Syrian outlaws would have a common view of the God of Israel. Ironic. Jephthah goes to war against the king of Ammon, whose god is Molech. The king of Ammon, how does he treat Molech? They sacrifice their children to Molech. Jephthah, who should be a son of God, who should be worshiping God according to the way that God wants him to, worships God as he would Molech, and sacrifices his daughter to the Ammonite god. I think many times, and this is a great quote from Mark Twain, we like to blame God for our own sins. And like that professor I was with in undergrad, he blamed God for the sins of Jephthah. He blamed God for the confusion that Jephthah had in his understanding of God. Unfortunately, the story of Jephthah is not over. If we go to Judges 12, 1 through 5, a very familiar story comes up. And this ties in a lot with the story of Gideon. So if you remember, Gideon goes and defeats the enemy, and who comes up to his door? The Ephraimites. Now the Ephraimites, they're on the west side of the Jordan, next to Gilead. They're on the west side, on the opposite side of the Jordan. The more pure side, theoretically. Less contact with the pagans. Well, at that time, the Ephraimites come to Gideon, and they are angry that Gideon did not invite them to come to war with them. And Gideon uses soft words. He says, "You're right, brothers. We are happy to have you. I made a mistake." And Ephraim goes home, and no bloodshed is done. Jephthah, you'd think he's a big wheeler and dealer. He'll figure this out as well. Same story. The Ephraimites come to Jephthah at the end of the war with the Ammonites, and the interaction is in Judges 12, 1 through 5. And it directly echoes how Gideon, and it contrasts how Gideon deals with the same problem. Let's read that together. So the 12:1. The men of Ephraim were called to arms. So they come armed. They're angry. They cross the Jordan, and they cross to Zaphon, and they said to Jephthah, "Why did you cross over to fight against the Ammonites and did not call us to go with you? We will burn your house over with fire." Now remember, we just learned recently, last Sabbath, that these tribes of Israel, these brothers, they were pretty violent. They were ready to go to war when they built a monument on the other side of Jordan. Similar thing. Ephraim comes, hard, heavy words. "We will burn your house with fire." This is the art of the deal, part 4. Jephthah and Ephraim. And Jephthah said to them, "I and my people had a great dispute with the Ammonites, and when I called you, you did not save me from their hand. And when I saw that you would not save me, I took my life and my hand and crossed over against the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into my hand. Why then have you come up to me this day to fight against me?" And Jephthah gathered all the men of Gilead and fought with Ephraim, and the men of Gilead struck Ephraim because they said, "You are fugitives of Ephraim, you Gileadites, in the midst of Ephraim and Manasseh." And the Gileadites captured the fords of the Jordan against the Ephraimites. And when any of the fugitives of Ephraim came and said, "Let me go over," the men of Gilead said to him, we'll pick that up in a second, just so we can see where we're at. You have Gad on the east side, where the Gileadites are, and you have Zaphon right there at Jordan, and you have the men of Ephraim in purple coming, and they meet there at Zaphon. So what happens is Jephthah routs them, captures the one place that they can cross back over home, and then they set up a checkpoint there. So the men of Ephraim would come to the ford to cross, and they would say, "Let me go over." And the men of Gilead said to him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" And they would, of course, say, "No." And they said to him, "Say Shibboleth." And he said, Sibboleth, excuse me. For they could not pronounce it properly. Very funny. So close. They live so close to each other, and they already have changes in their dialect. It's like telling a Texan, "Say you all," and they say y'all, and then you just kill the Texan. That's what they did. So what did they do after they couldn't pronounce Shibboleth and they said Sibboleth? They seized him and slaughtered him at the fords of the Jordan, and at that time 42,000 Ephraimites fell. In my eyes, this is the tragedy of Jephthah. How he lived his life, how he was raised. He worshiped God the wrong way, killed his daughter, and in the end, when it should be a great victory for the Lord, why have you come out against me? I went and I fought the Ammonites. It's all about me and my leadership. And in the end, you have the people of Gilead destroying and killing 42,000 of their brothers across the river. That was the state of Israel at that time. It's a very sad testament. So my question for us is, what can we learn from this tragic story? One, I think very important. We have to have no other gods before our God. And you look at the way that Israel at that time worshipped. In Judges 17, it says that every man did what was right in his own eyes. you'll read in the Old Testament that somebody would go grab a Levite and make him set up and priest of his ephod, and they would have their own kind of religion. They would worship God peripherally. They would worship some of the pagan gods. We can have no other God but our God. Again, we should refrain from seeking to manipulate our God, as Jephthah did. All the other leaders and judges, you even look at David, shall I go up and do this? Not if I do this, will you do that? We should not seek to manipulate our God. We should seek to abide by his will. An interesting thing, sexual purity. So I'm going to go back to Gideon because this ties together real well. Gideon has his own wife. He has 70 sons. And of those 70 sons, they rule the land. But one son he has with a foreign woman, and that son is Abimelech. And a few chapters ahead, what does Abimelech do? He kills all 70 of Gideon's sons, and he tries to make himself king. Gilead has his own sons of the wife that he had, but as well, he finds a prostitute, a pagan prostitute. Many of these prostitutes were shrine prostitutes in that time. It was a religious thing on top of just a prostitution. And he has Jephthah. And you see the trouble that Jephthah makes for Israel. So there is something to be said about living to the way God would have us live. To have your wife. To not go out and have fornication with those around you. Next, how are we raising our children? Are we raising our children in close proximity to idolatry? If you look at Abimelech, he was not raised the way the rest of his brothers were. If you look at Jephthah, he was raised in close proximity to paganism. He was an outcast. He raised his own daughter in close proximity to paganism. How are we raising our children? Because when you grow up in this fashion, you get views of your God that are not realistic. And Jephthah viewed and worshipped his God like all pagans would worship their God at that time. He was confused. He was confused on how to properly relate with the God of Israel. That ties in with today, are we worshiping God according to how he would like us to worship him? Or are we worshiping him according to how our culture that we've been raised thinks is the right way to worship him? And I think that's important because you look at how many religions, how many flavors do we have out there of worshiping God? You'll have the Catholics, the Protestants. You'll have different flavors, praise churches, conservative churches. We're so confused. We're so mixed up. When if there is one God, there's only one way that he would like to be worshipped. So I ask us to look into our own lives. Are we worshiping God the way he wants us to worship him? Next, why is the world the way it is? Why is God so cruel? We shouldn't blame the Lord for our own foolishness. For the foolishness of Jephthah, it wasn't God's fault. It wasn't God's fault that Jephthah made such a foolish vow, that he opened his mouth all the time. It wasn't God's fault that Jephthah went then and decided to kill all the Ephraimites, whereas he could have diffused the situation like Gideon did just a few chapters previously. And I think we should be careful how we interpret our scripture. It's interesting because when I looked over a lot of the commentaries, a lot of the older commentaries, they praised Jephthah. What a pious man. What a man of faith. He did these great things. But I think as you look at it and you view things in their context, he's not a man to be praised, but a man to learn from. And I ask that we can learn from him today and not repeat any of his mistakes. Second to last point. After such a great defeat against the forces of evil, Jephthah then goes and kills 42,000 of his own people. I always thought of when the people of Israel came into the land of Canaan, they were a close-knit group of 12 tribes. But it becomes very evident the more we read in Joshua and the more we learn here that they all did their own thing, they all fragmented, and they all had deep prejudices against each other. They were just a few words away from killing 42,000 of each other. And then finally, I think that Jephthah also shows a bit of hope for us today. Because still somehow he ends up in Hebrews 11, that whole hall of faith, where Jephthah is considered one of the people who did great things in the hall of faith. So despite despite all the mistakes he made, despite all the words that he could not take back, all the times he opened his mouth and he couldn't take it back, offending the Ammonites, trying to make himself king, trying, not allowing himself to back out of the vow, and then also fighting with the Ephraimites. Despite all of that, the Lord can still take somebody like Jephthah and put them into the hall of faith. So I think that brings hope for us today, and the lessons that we can learn from Jephthah. Thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we can consider Jephthah the remainder of this Sabbath day and learn from the mistakes he has made. Thank you.